Throughout history, humans have devised ways to punish others that are so brutal, they seem almost unbelievable. From torturous devices designed to inflict maximum pain to punishments that broke not just the body but the spirit, the methods of delivering justice were often as cruel as the crimes they aimed to punish. But what drives societies to create such extreme measures? And which punishment was so horrifying it became legendary? Stick around, because what you're about to discover will leave you questioning how far humanity can go in the name of justice. The Brazen Bull. Imagine a device so horrific that its very name sends shivers down your spine, the Brazen Bull. This ancient Greek invention was a gruesome tool of torture and execution, designed to amplify the suffering of its victims in a way that no one would ever forget. The Brazen Bull was a massive bronze sculpture crafted in the shape of a bull. Its creators ingeniously designed it with an eerie purpose in mind. Victims were placed inside this hollow bull, and a fire was lit underneath. As the flames roared and heated the bronze, the unfortunate souls inside were roasted alive. But the torment didn't stop at the physical pain. The Brazen Bull had a sinister twist. The victim's screams would travel through the hollow body of the bull and out through its mouth. This was no ordinary roar. The sound was engineered to mimic the deep, bellowing cry of a bull, turning every scream of agony into a horrifying symphony of suffering. Why was such a cruel device invented? It was all about making a statement. The Brazen Bull was favored by tyrants who wanted to demonstrate their extreme cruelty and instill fear. Its creator, Persia, faced a grim twist of fate himself. According to legend, he was the first to be punished by the very device he invented. After designing it, the tyrant who commissioned the bull decided to turn it against him, proving just how ruthless and unpredictable such tyrants could be. Scaphism, the boats. Scaphism, also known as the boats, is one of the most nightmarish forms of execution ever conceived. Originating in ancient Persia, this method was designed to inflict prolonged agony and suffering. Here's how it worked. The victim was placed between two boats, or more accurately, two hollowed-out wooden vessels. The person was then restrained, making any escape impossible. To ensure a slow and horrific death, the executioners would feed the victim a mix of milk and honey. This sweet concoction wasn't just a gruesome touch, it was deliberately intended to attract insects. Once the victim was sealed between the boats, left in a swamp or another infested environment, the insects would swarm. They'd be drawn to the milk and honey, but their role went beyond just feeding. The insects would start to devour the victim's flesh, while the milk and honey caused additional discomfort and increased the likelihood of infection. This method of execution was brutally slow. Victims could endure for days or even weeks, suffering through relentless pain and torment. The process not only ensured a prolonged and excruciating death, but also served as a grim warning to anyone who might consider crossing those in power. Scaphism stands as a dark symbol of the extremes to which ancient cultures would go to impose punishment, illustrating a horrifying chapter in the history of torture. Breaking wheel, Catherine wheel. The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, is a chilling example of medieval European torture methods. This device was designed to inflict maximum pain and humiliation before death. Here's how it worked. The condemned person was strapped to a large wooden wheel. This wheel wasn't just any wheel, it was a massive, often crudely constructed contraption. Once secured, the executioners used a heavy hammer to systematically smash the victim's limbs, breaking the bones in a brutal and methodical manner. But the cruelty didn't stop there. After the limbs were shattered, they were threaded through the spokes of the wheel. This grim display served as both a final act of torture and a public spectacle. The broken body, splayed out on the wheel, was left exposed and vulnerable. The breaking wheel was not only designed to kill, but also to prolong suffering and ensure a deeply humiliating end. Victims would often die from shock, excessive blood loss, or exposure to the elements. The process could be agonizingly slow, and the sight of the victim on the wheel was intended to deter others from committing crimes. Sawing. Sawing was a horrifying method of execution used in various parts of the world, including Europe and Asia. This gruesome practice involved hanging the condemned person upside down and then sawing them in half, starting at the groin and working downwards towards the head. The victim was suspended by their legs, their body fully inverted. The executioner would then use a large saw to begin cutting through the body. The choice to start at the groin meant that the vital organs were affected later in the process, but the victim remained conscious for much of the ordeal. This was because blood rushed to their head, keeping them aware of the excruciating pain as the saw cut through flesh and bone. The sawing process was not just about causing pain, but also about making the execution as agonizingly slow and terrifying as possible. The victim's awareness and suffering could last for a prolonged period, making it one of the most agonizing methods of execution ever devised. Crucifixion. Crucifixion stands out as one of the most brutal forms of punishment ever devised in history. It was more than just a method of execution, it was a deliberate act of suffering designed to make an example out of the condemned. The process was horrifyingly simple yet devastatingly effective. The victim was either nailed or tied to a large wooden cross, with their arms stretched wide and their feet bound or nailed together. This wasn't a quick death. The victim would endure excruciating pain for hours, sometimes even days, As they struggled to breathe, their bodies slowly succumbing to exhaustion, dehydration, and eventually suffocation. The suffering was relentless, with every breath becoming more difficult than the last. Crucifixion was primarily used by the Romans as a punishment for those they considered the worst of the worst slaves who dared to revolt, rebels who challenged Roman authority, and criminals who committed heinous acts. It was a punishment meant not just to kill, but to send a message. But the Romans didn't just want the victim to die, they wanted everyone to see it. The crucified were often left on display in public places, their bodies exposed to the elements and to onlookers. This served as a grim warning to anyone who might consider defying Roman rule. The sight of a crucified person was meant to strike fear into the hearts of the living, reminding them of the consequences of crossing the empire. In its cruelty, crucifixion was not just about inflicting pain, it was about stripping away the victim's dignity, reducing them to a spectacle of suffering. The victim's body would hang lifelessly on the cross, often left for birds and wild animals to scavenge, a final indignity and a punishment designed to dehumanize. Hanged, drawn, and quartered. Hanged, drawn, and quartered, these three words describe one of the most gruesome punishments in history. In medieval England, this was the fate of those convicted of treason. The condemned were first hanged, but not to death, just enough to bring them to the brink. Then, while still alive, they were cut down, disemboweled, and their insides burned before their very eyes. The final horror came with quartering, where their bodies were divided into 4 parts, often still conscious. These mutilated remains were then sent across the country, displayed as a chilling warning to others who might dare to betray the crown. This punishment wasn't just about physical agony, it was a calculated spectacle meant to instill fear and obedience. Reserved only for the gravest offenses against the state, it sent a clear message: treason would be met with the most extreme and public suffering imaginable. The sheer brutality of being hanged, drawn, and quartered cemented it as one of the darkest chapters in the history of justice. Lingchi, death by 1,000 cuts. Lingchi, also known as death by 1,000 cuts, stands out as one of the most brutal punishments in history. Practiced in China until the early 20th century, it involves slowly slicing the victim's body into multiple pieces over a prolonged period. The agony wasn't just in the physical pain, but in the psychological torment it inflicted. Imagine being sentenced to such a fate, knowing that each cut brought you closer to death, yet keeping you alive long enough to experience excruciating suffering. This punishment wasn't used for petty crimes, it was reserved for those who committed severe offenses like treason or patricide. The goal wasn't just to kill, but to make an example out of the condemned. Lingchi symbolized the absolute power of the state, an ultimate reminder that the authority over life and death was firmly in the hands of the rulers. It served as a terrifying warning to anyone who dared challenge the established order. Even for those who weren't subjected to it, the mere knowledge of such a punishment instilled fear. It was a method of control, a way to maintain order through the most extreme means imaginable. If you found this topic fascinating, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history's most shocking and little-known facts.